Great, welcome everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah. My name is Christina Holker. I'm Executive Director of FIDO Alliance along with Andrew. I'm happy to be here today to moderate a panel about how the Financial Data Exchange and FIDO work together to secure access and consumer data sharing. So I'd like to ask my panelists to introduce themselves. Maybe we could start at the other end with Jeremy Grant.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Jeremy Grant. I'm Managing Director with Venable's Cybersecurity and Privacy Practice out of Washington, D.C., and have worked as an advisor to FIDO over the years.
Liz?
Sure. Hi, I'm Liz Votaw. I used to lead the Authentication organization, Consumer Authentication organization at Wells Fargo, and before that at Bank of America. And now I'm an independent consultant in the authentication and identity space.
And Don, maybe you'd like to introduce yourself and just tell us a bit about FDX and why you're here today.
Happy to. Hi, I'm Don Cardinal. I'm the Managing Director of the Financial Data Exchange. So FDX is a technical standards body that's bringing open banking, or really open finance, to North America. It's got 200 member organizations on 4 continents. So why in the world is an open banking group here at FIDO and Authenticate? One of the things we found is for any given bank or brokerage or credit union, roughly a third of their customers have given up their ID and password to one or more fintech apps. So if you do the math very quickly, you realize that there's roughly 110 million, or at its peak, we're 110 million credential pairs floating around in the ether. FDX has been able to, as of July, remediate 22 million of those and turn those into tokenized API access. And we hope to be at a much larger number by next spring as well. But we're using a variety of tools, using OpenID Connect and our APIs. They're open, they're free of charge. We encourage you to learn more about FDX. It's an open consortium, but we're just trying to solve this for everyone.
Thanks, Don. So just to dive into the questions, why are strong authentication standards particularly suited to open finance and financial institutions? Liz, given you're the financial institution expert, maybe you'd like to take that one first?
Sure. You know, when you think about FIDO and FDX, there's a great synergy between the two because you have a standard talking to a standard. And what that does for you as a financial institution is it creates a tremendous amount of consistency and something that can be trusted across different areas of your organization. So especially at large financial institutions, there's a lot of different organizations internally, and when you have a standard like FIDO and a standard like FDX, it makes it much easier operationally to start to put things into place because you know exactly what you're dealing with. You know exactly what the technology is, and you don't have to start from scratch to try to develop you know, a new technology solution to solve for the problems that these great standards solve for.
Great, thank you. Next one to you, Don. What strong authentication standards are supported by FDX?
Sure. I mean, FDX borrowed heavily from around the world. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel, as Liz mentioned. So, for example, our security framework is based on the NIST cybersecurity framework. We use FAPI 1.0 Advanced and CIBA for the authentication flows, and then we recommend strong customer auth for the customer consent piece of it, and we highly encourage our members and users of FDX to use FIDO biometrics, partly because they're so good, but partly also because they're so customer friendly. Remember, the customers on your cyber team, you need them to get through this flow. A flow that they won't use is not very useful. And so we actually focus group tested this in a variety of modalities and with a variety of level of cyber awareness, if you will, of different folks, and FIDO biometric enrollment tested it off the charts in all instances. So that's why we actually wrote it into our guidelines.
Thank you. Jeremy, why would a standards body lean on the work of other standards such as OpenID Connect and FIDO?
I think at a high level, it just makes things easier. I mean, the great thing about standards is once we figured out a way to solve a problem once at a technical level, let's look to reuse it again and again. And I think it's been nice to see not just FIDO, but not to get overly religious on a Wednesday morning, I have to call the holy trinity of OpenID Connect and OAuth 2 and FIDO being used to enable secure authentication and secure data exchange, be it with FDX in healthcare, FDX in financial services, or also some of what we're seeing in healthcare right now under the interoperability rules of the 21st Century Cures Act, where they're also looking to have people set up APIs and looking, in many cases, to FIDO for the authentication. So I think, just taking 2 steps back, the problem we're trying to solve is how do we let somebody, access, or grant access to, say, a third-party fintech app to their bank data without having to hand over their password. And so much of the fintech boom that we've had here, just not only in the U.S. but across the world, has been driven by essentially trying to convince people that they should do the one thing that we tell them every October in anti-phishing campaigns that they should never do, which is give their username and password to somebody else, let alone their bank password, which is arguably the most important one they have.
Yeah.
Christian might think it's his Gmail password instead, but. So, leveraging, standards like FIDO and OpenID Connect that allow people to actually do that in a secure fashion, provision access through an API, makes it much easier and much more secure to do so than this old regime we've had of trying to get, essentially, cache credentials from people and then log in as them several times a day to make all of this ecosystem happen.
Yeah. Can I just tell an anecdote for a moment? Don, I don't know, I didn't tell you I was going to say this, but so Don and I used to work at Bank of America together, and at one point, Don was very focused on solving for the fintech, the FDX model before there was even, the formal FDX that's in place today. And I was very focused on bringing FIDO to Bank of America. And it felt at first like these were very different tracks. Don's over here in his lane and I'm over here in my lane. But after some conversation, it was very clear that these 2 things are enablers. That, Don learned about FIDO from me, and he was able to go back to FDX and start to talk about, this really needs to be part of our guidelines. Part of our documentation is that the best way to implement your FDX strategy is with FIDO. And then likewise, understanding what FDX is all about is another way to make sure that FIDO is interoperable with things like FDX. So there's definitely a marriage here between the 2.
So one of the things
Bring back memories, Don?
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. I remember those discussions. One of the things, if we're going to a passwordless world, we need to get rid of the business drivers to share passwords and to have passwords. And that's sort of what FDX does. FIDO helps that along. But you've really got to, if you strike out the business need, because I think all our members realize that passwords are going to be a net liability. They're really dangerous and they could go off on you at any time. So if you don't have them, you've reduced your risk profile. So everyone in the ecosystem, all 200 plus members, want to get to that passwordless state because the risk is increasing and the benefit just isn't there.
Yeah.
I think the other thing we've seen is this model that sort of version 1 of fintech apps, was based off of around getting people to share their passwords, breaks really hard when banks start to implement multi-factor authentication. And, be it banks' interests themselves, regulators pushing them to do so. If your model is, well, I've just got Liz's username and password and I can log in 4 times a day to her B of A account. Still the B of A account?
Yeah.
Anyway.
And a Wells Fargo.
And a Wells Fargo account. I don't know if you win PNC or something now that you're freelance. But,
No.
If they're suddenly going to be prompting for a second factor, well, that model doesn't work. You can't have account access. And in fact, there's been a lot of articles around, apps like Venmo or Mint where suddenly people were locked out, of it if they had, say, a B of A account at one point because they were implementing MFA. So, we sort of, when you see where all of that's going, we know how this movie ends. You can't use password caching anymore. You can't be screen scraping anymore. It's going to have to move to the FDX API, and it's going to have to support multi-factor authentication. And so I think that's, to me, the excitement of what, Don and his colleagues have done at FDX has been bringing banks and fintechs together to agree on how, all of that's going to work.
Yeah.
Yeah, some great points there. Don, back to you, just sort of focusing back on FDX. There's sort of some perceptions around the geographical relevance of FDX. So are the authentication standards applicable across jurisdictions?
They absolutely are. We shop the planet, and I know our friends, I saw Gail and Michael from OpenID Foundation here earlier. We realized we've got members on 4 continents. We wrote this to be a global spec, and certainly we've had the most uptake in North America, but we wrote this to be used anywhere, so it's GDPR and CCPA compliant, PSD2 compliant. So if you look, we use FAPI 1.0 Advanced and SIVA, which are used in Australia, they're used in the UK, they're being adopted in Germany, they're used in Dubai, Mexico, Brazil, and other open banking or open finance jurisdictions. Again, the NIST cyber framework I think is applicable anywhere, and FIDO, of course, is the global spec as well for strong customer auth. So we wrote it in mind of going global, but certainly building local first.
That's great, thank you. Switching gears a little bit, back to Jeremy. We have a recent confirmation to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Do you have any sort of perspectives or thoughts on this appointment?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably worth talking a little bit more about the regulatory environment and how I think that's going to be driving some things I think that are going to be quite favorable to FDX. Which is, so I think a lot of folks are familiar with what Europe's done in open banking. There was PSD2, the Payment Services Directive 2, that was put in place several years ago, which was a very, I would say that Europe, as they often do, took a very regulatory heavy approach in terms of saying, here's how things are going to work between banks and fintechs. In the US, we haven't had any regulation to date. When Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act in the wake of the financial crisis back in 2009, they granted the newly established CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the authority to regulate, but for the last 10 years or so, they haven't. I mean, the most they've done is basically put out principles in terms of open access to financial data that says, here's kind of what we want everybody to do, which, I read, and I think a lot of others, in industry and in Washington read as signal to both banks and fintechs, keep working toward this, keep doing what you're doing, but, they have the authority to regulate. Well, that all changed about a year ago when the CFPB put out what they call an advance notice of proposed rulemaking. And this was under Kathy Kraninger, who was the director of CFPB during the Trump administration. Basically said, look, we're going to do a rule here. And they asked a whole bunch of questions, including a lot about, can you actually have secure screen scraping? What are the implications of password sharing? What should we do looking at things like FDX? And there was, tons of industry comments. I know FDX submitted comments, FIDO Alliance submitted comments on this. Now there's a new director. Biden administration nominated Rohit Chopra, who was just confirmed by the Senate very narrowly just a few days ago. I think the general take is he's going to be a much more activist director relative to his predecessor, and probably on balance less friendly to incumbent banks and more interested in things from a regulatory standpoint than they can do to shake up the financial system a little bit and introduce new competitors. What that's going to mean to whatever regulations they put out here, it's hard to say, but I do think you'll be seeing something. I don't know. What are we expecting, Don? Early next year, probably.
Yeah, late spring is probably a proposed rule.
Yeah, so you see an actual proposed regulation come out, and I think we'll know a lot more about what the regulatory environment in the U.S. is going to look like around open banking. At that point, my personal hope is they take a lighter touch than what we saw in Europe, where I think we're still hearing from a lot of European banks and fintechs that because the rules were so prescriptive, people still can't figure out how to implement them properly. And so, my personal take is pointing to things like what FDX has done and then trying to put some teeth around it to basically get banks to get moving a little more will probably be, the right approach to drive open banking, open finance in the U.S.
We've gotten a sense from the regulators, and we talk to them frequently. We talk to Treasury, OCC, FFIEC, you name the alphabet soup, we've been there. And from the gist of the discussions, there's a clear understanding of what they do best and what industry does best. And we call it the what's and the how. The policy discussion, the policy outcomes, the what they want to have happen are clearly policy informed the regulator. But the how you get there and how you do it securely and at enterprise scale, they really have decided that the market is best suited for that. And so they're going to leave, I think, a lot of the technical pieces up to industry to solve and to innovate. One of the points that was made is for a Bluetooth standard, for example, has changed 4 or 5 times since it was introduced, yet everything's still interoperable because the market has every incentive to make sure that does so. So I think whatever comes out, I think that whole thematic of what's and how's being separate, I think will continue. I think the industry consortiums like FDX will continue to drive innovation and adopt what's coming on with FIDO and FAPI and other things.
Oh, that's great. So to sort of wrap up the questions, I'm going to ask all 3 of you to weigh in on this. Maybe we could start with Liz. She's been a little quiet for the last couple of questions. So in terms of the benefits of standardization in the authentication space, You know, what's really important from a consumer experience and confidence perspective, security, parity, and compliance?
Yeah, so I mean, going back to what Don mentioned, it all comes down to what is that consumer experience, what's the flow. So, you know, like Jeremy was saying, if you're trying to get into your account, whether that's through a fintech or that's through your bank, that's what you're trying to do. You're not trying to remember, you don't want to have to remember your password or remember that you changed your password last week and now you don't remember what it is anymore. If you have an easy, simple, and secure way to do that, that just reflects well on every experience that you're going to try to do. So it sounds really simplistic. Of course you want to have a great experience, but it's remarkable how challenging it can be to get to that place. And FIDO just makes it that much simpler, because once you make the decision to implement FIDO, it's always FIDO. It's just always the same technology, it's always the same standard, and then you can make, you know, ensure that your customer experience is exactly what the customer wants, which is get me access, that's what I'm here to do.
Yeah, and I'd say just on top of that, I mean, looking at some of the discussions we had in Europe over the years with, you know, some of the European financial institutions and fintechs and regulators, I mean, there they were really focused on, I alluded before how they were getting overly specific. You know, in Europe, they're actually describing different models that you can use and, you know, sort of explaining where like the bits and bytes have to go at each step in a way that got so overly specific. In some cases, it seemed to preclude the use of something like FIDO because, like, you know, in many cases, they just assume there'd be a one-time passcode instead. And it's taken a lot of education to point out that as you're trying to deliver, you know, a superior customer experience, FIDO really gives you the benefit of having, you know, the best security and something that's just a simple one-step process for, you know, consumer to quickly, you know, essentially log into their bank and tell their bank through an API to grant a third-party fintech, you know, access to certain data or privileges associated with that account. So, you know, that, I would say, you know, FIDO and the FDX API are really emerging, I think, at the right time for where we're at in this, you know, broader explosion of innovation in financial services, in that it, you know, should make it really easy for consumers to have a good experience, for banks to feel comfortable that they're still fulfilling their duty to customers and to regulators to, you know, protect money and data, and to fintech apps to start to compete with some of the banks and, you know, offer different types of services.
Let me just add one other benefit in this space is that as our platform companies continue to innovate and come up with, and the device manufacturers innovate and come up with new ways for people to authenticate or create strong authentication on those devices, the beauty of FIDO is that I, as a bank, I don't have to worry that I now have to start from scratch with a whole new technology project to keep up with the times, because that would then interrupt the flow where I'm not ready for that kind of implementation, but the fintechs are still here trying to get access for our shared customer. So the beauty of FIDO, again, is that it's a technology standard that can evolve with the innovations that are going on, you know, in real time. And so, you know, all the things that Christian was talking about are coming. Those are all things that can easily be implemented through your FIDO implementation, and then you don't have any interruption with the customer experience.
And so, you know, again, getting back to the original question of why rely on existing standards and existing things, because they're known, they're trusted. You have a lot of new entrants coming into the space and competing, but they may be new to certain aspects and you can't be an expert in everything. But if you can stack together known existing modules and modalities and security, again, it starts out, the baseline they start out is just so much better. I think there you prevent a lot of rookie mistakes, if you will, from new entrants. And I think it gives everyone in the ecosystem a sense of relief or a sense of trust with that. But I will talk a little bit, Liz mentioned user experience. Because we're market driven and not regulatory driven, customer experience is paramount. And we actually, we have an API working group, a security working group, and a user experience group. The roster for the UX working group is actually larger than either of the other two, because it's that important. We actually, even though we're not-for-profit, spent money focus group testing what the experience was going to be like to make sure we didn't have abandons. Because again, what good is security if users don't adopt it, don't feel comfortable about it? So it's very much in the front of our minds that this has to work at an economic scale. This has to work for small mom and pop credit unions and two young ladies in a garage out of University of Washington, or the biggest of the bigs. And it has to work for everybody. And that's why standards are so vitally important. And it's why we're here.
Yeah, that's a very valid point, actually. We've heard that fairly consistently over the course of the conference as to how important consumer experience is. And security is no good unless you have that usability and the consumer experience. So totally agree. So just to wrap up, Don, is there anything else that you want the audience to take away or to understand about FDX?
Really, our spec is free of charge. Just come to our site. We just ask you, promise not to try to patent it. Then you get a free license to use it in perpetuity forever. So 2, we'd love to have you join. We'd love to have your input. Tell us what we're doing wrong. Tell us what we're doing right. Tell us how to make it better. We'd love to have you. We're ridiculously cheap to join. I had to put the pitch in there. But realistically, we'd love your input, especially if you see things we can improve on. We'd love to hear.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Don, Liz, and Jeremy for being here. I think we have a few minutes for questions if anybody has anything they'd like to hear more about.
We do. I have some in the app. Does anyone in the room want to ask a question before we get into the questions online? Okay, thank you. So for Don, I think this question's for you. Is FIDO going to be a requirement for FDX, or are the more traditional OIDC authentication methods going to be allowed in the future?
Okay, good question. We have to meet the market where it's at. So we insist on strong customer auth, but if you're not FIDO enabled, if you're not biometric enabled, we certainly don't want to preclude you from that, because it sure beats the heck out of sharing IDs and passwords. So again, if you did it with a push message, okay, fine. So there are other ways to authenticate that still meet muster in jurisdictions for strong customer auth, but we want to meet you where you're at. But we wouldn't have put FIDO in our spec if we didn't encourage people to use it.
Thank you. Can anybody on the panel talk a little bit about how FDX might compare to the open banking regulations in Europe and Australia?
Sure. If you look at the regulatory top-down approach, they were primarily trying to drive payments, and so they looked at current accounts. So if you look, if you look at the UK, you look at EU, you look at Australia, checking, savings accounts known as current accounts, and credit cards are primarily all that's in scope. In the market-driven solution, we said, okay, what's being scraped today? So that includes pensions, 401ks, IRAs, auto loans, mortgages, healthcare information, property and casualty insurance information, and anything else that's being scraped from an FI today, that's in scope. That's why we use the term open finance instead of open data, open banking. The other thing is, because we're market-driven, we can innovate. We're the only spec that has a fraud API. Right now, if a fintech app sees something unusual with Jeremy's account, unless they know somebody at the bank, there's no real mechanism for them to doing that. Even though they're saying, hey, I've got some good signals intel, they have no way of doing that. With version 5 of our API, they can go back up those same exact rails they were pulling data from, secure channel, and say it's Jeremy, it's this account, and here's what I saw. So it's a trusted source, high signal to noise ratio, so it can go right into the SOC and be actioned. Why did we build? No one told us to build it, but the market said this is a good idea, and the market said let's do this. So when you listen to the market, you're going to solve things that are sustainable, and I like to say no taxpayer dollars were hurt in the making of this film.
And I think another way to look at it is, what you've seen in other countries is they passed a regulation to try to drive innovation. In the US, the government's taken more or less a hands-off approach to date and let the market drive things. And now the CFPB's announced that they're now going to come in and regulate probably more around the edges to maybe fill in some gaps or make some corrections where they believe that they need to be made to what the market's done. But I think by letting the market lead first, the U.S. is ultimately going to get further and have, I think, a better balance between regulation and innovation.
Thank you. Go ahead.
I have a question. Does FDX also include the mechanisms by which to ensure that the relying party is a trusted endpoint? In other words, how do you know who's at the other end? I'm the bank. How do I know I should trust that organization to pull that person's data?
So if you look at the security stack right now, even to get permission to talk to an FI, you go through a bilateral agreement. And so if you look at the security stack, even to get into the WAF, you have to have a good token, a good certificate. You have to be on the approved list. Your IPs have to be in the access control list. And even then, there's MTLS on top of the TLS tunnel that goes in there. So there's a variety of checks and balances to make sure that you and only you can get in, that only your firm can get in. And then, for example, if you're a tax prep firm, you're not trying to pull non-tax data out of it.
So we've got real-time payments coming in the U.S. in 2023. How's all these pieces fit together?
Well, RTP exists today. FedNow is coming in 2023. RTP exists today, so TCH is on my board. Got to represent. But really, if you think about it, look at the ACH rules. You're required to say, yes, this is Bill's account, and Bill's account has sufficient funds. Today, they do it via trial deposit, which takes days, or you can share ID or password, which we don't want to do. So the FDX, by having these secure connections, allows you to then say, yep, it's Bill's account in real time with a high degree of assurance without sharing credentials. So absolutely, it's useful in payment initiation and verification.
All right, I think that concludes this session. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.